of double duty here this afternoon, so I'm going to introduce the next panel leader and bring him up on stage, and he'll introduce the other individuals that are going to be a part of this discussion. We're going to move the discussion into something I know will be very interesting to everybody, and that's the changing trends we're seeing in the political landscape. And we're delighted to welcome several experts who will be introduced by Dr. John Taylor, who will be moderating this discussion. I think many of you know that John Taylor is the Marion Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow of Economics at the Hoover Institution, also at Stanford University, which happens to be my business school alma mater as well. I've had the great privilege of knowing John during the time that he was in the administration, George Bush's administration, as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, and I served as the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee for International Organizations, and it was a great privilege to work with him very, very closely, and I have just nothing but the greatest respect and admiration for both his intellect and his integrity, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to the stage. John, thank you.
So my colleagues will join me. Vanessa, there you are. Tharman. And where's Clare? Okay, great. So grab your seats. The purpose of this session is to examine where the different policy issues, trade policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy impact different parts of the world, different regions. And we're very pleased to have Deputy Prime Minister Tharman from Singapore, who's also been chairman of the IMFC, chairman of the Group of 30, and one of my favorite things, chairman of the Singapore Monetary Authority. How can you do all these things? And Vanessa Rubio, who's now Undersecretary of Finance in Mexico, previously Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs and for Development. So it's terrific to have you here with your experience from your part of the world. And Clare Woodman is the Global COO of Morgan Stanley International Securities, with global responsibilities, obviously, for coordinating various things about the firm and their investment strategies. So we're going to have a sense, a little bit about what's going on around the world. So I've been asked to kind of start sort of describing a little bit about the impact of recent policies in the United States. So I'll take my 2 or 3 or 4 minutes to do that. I think the U.S. problem is pretty much what we've already talked about, is low growth. Maybe it's a little better than some places, but it's not good by our standards. 2.1% since the Great Recession was over, and of course, including that terrible situation, even worse. So I think policy should be directed to raising economic growth above this 2% and get back to the kind of recoveries the United States has had in the past. I think in many respects, there's some changes that are either beginning or underway, or we could hope will happen, which will boost economic growth in the U.S. And they're the things I've been talking about for quite a while, actually. They're regulatory reform, tax reform, financial, monetary reform, even budget reform. And all of those, there's been much more talk about it recently. In fact, maybe that the MD referred to the extent that maybe that's part of the reason for the more optimistic outlook that the IMF has put through, including for the United States. So as I see these policies, let's take regulatory reform, which is so much behind the scenes, and it's hard to follow, there's so many things, but the Congress has this Congressional Review Act, which has already rolled back 13 regulations that were passed recently. And then there's other things like that. Financial regulation issues, they're being reconsidered. The House Financial Services Committee has a whole set of reforms, actually passed the whole House of Representatives, and administration is looking at those. We don't know where they'll come out exactly. It's part of a review the Secretary of the Treasury is working on. But it's a different outlook in both of those items than before. tax reform gets a huge amount of discussion, which it should because it's so important. And here there is disagreement. The border tax adjustment still being debated, but in the meantime, there's more agreement about what to do on tax reform than there has been for a long, long time. Trying to reduce rates, trying to broaden the base, and so that's a different kind of discussion that we've had. Even on the budget, the Secretary Mnuchin had an interview in the FT where he focuses on this infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily mean a big expansion of the budget. Depends on how it's financed. So the budget is something they're thinking about, and the budget director Mulvaney is certainly thinking about it, as you already have heard a little bit. So just on the monetary side, I think there's some move for the Fed to begin normalizing. I think that has international implications because other central banks are part of the international financial system and may begin to react to that. The dollar moved a lot after the first move, but basically it's kind of back to where it was before the Fed's first move. And I think that may be some reflection of the international reactions, at least possible reactions that are happening. So as I look at this changing situation, it drives me just to conclude with what about the international trade side of this, which is on everybody's mind. And I think it should be on our mind. And got to look carefully. We'll hear more about that from my colleagues on the stage, but what I'd like to think about the direction of trade discussions now is it's finding ways to further open markets. If you, again, maybe read Secretary Mnuchin's interview, there's focus on opening rather than closing. And that's what I think we in the international community should think about, whether it becomes more bilateral, the US and Singapore have a bilateral FTA, or different than the TPP would have been, whatever it is there a way that we can direct that dialogue, I say, in the direction of good economics? It requires work. It requires work from people like us to do it. So anyway, that's where I think of it, what's happening. It's a lot going on, and it's sort of there's more agreement than there has in the past, not completely agreement. And the question is, can this actually be pulled off? Can we actually do it? And we'll hear more about that. Now, I think maybe, is it okay? We'll start with you, Tharman?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's always a pleasure to start without a question being asked. That's just right. But maybe to take off from what you were saying, John, I think the key issue when you talk about policy changes in the US or the Fed and what its implications are for the rest of the world is not so much about the short-term jiggles and the ups and downs in the markets, although that's something that has to be managed. The key issue is just uncertainty. It's an issue which pervades the markets. It's an issue which influences investment decisions or the lack of them. And it's an issue that's, I think, affecting the politics of the land everywhere. There's too much uncertainty, and there's a lack of direction. And I think we have to think more about that as itself an objective of policy. How do you reduce uncertainty? How do you get on with it? Set the course, progress in calibrated steps, but be clear about where we are going. So that's a broad point I'd make, whether it's on monetary policy or a range of other policies. You've got to reduce uncertainty because it's good for investment, good for productivity, and ultimately good for inclusive growth.
Anything you want to say in particular about Singapore, Asia in this dimension, or should we come back to that?
We can come back to that.
Okay, Vanessa, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, well, I totally agree with Mr. Tharman. I think that uncertainty has been the main characteristic of the recent episodes of change, of volatility, of external shocks that Mexico has been experiencing for the last 6 months in particular. So what I think we should be looking into is to the fact that how this uncertainty that has been created by a lot of expectations, some of them more correct than other ones, some of them more intense than other ones, have created this anxiety and this volatility in markets that in the short term, obviously they matter for the medium and long term, but in the short term have created a lot of disruption in markets. In the case of Mexico, a lot of disruption in terms of the FX, a lot of disruption in terms of decision making for investment in the short run. And no matter, it hasn't, I mean, we have been able to be resilient because we have strong fundamentals, because we are doing the reforms, the 11 reforms, specifically those in the case of the energy reform, the telecom reform, the financial sector reform, have been quite proactive in terms of our implementation recently. But still facing these shocks have been quite a challenge, despite the fact that we have macro stability, macro fundamentals. We have been able to grow at a rate of 2.3% last year, despite the fact that the industrial sector in the US not grew and had a minus 1% growth last year. So we have managed to be resilient in a context in which we have been implementing the reforms, in a context in which we have been developing the domestic market to make it, to create more domestic demand, the highest creation of jobs, 2.7 million in the last 4.5 years. But still, these shocks that we have been facing have destroyed a lot of value and have created a framework of uncertainty that had to be dealt by through a series of policies. And obviously, in the recent months, I think there has been an anchoring of the dialogue between Mexico and the United States. There was a huge array of possible scenarios that were discussed, and now we have been able to narrow them down and be able to conduct a more day-to-day and formal conversations with the US authorities in terms of trade, in terms of migration, in terms of financial fiscal affairs. So, and that's what we aim to. But still, I think that, as Mr. Tharman said, I think uncertainty is something of a novelty in terms of how we deal with it, how we are able to set the proper elements in our national and international structures in order to be able to reduce it and to have more certainty for the future, for decision making and for development and for growth and for these kind of decisions.
Thank you, Claire. Do you also want to talk about uncertainty or certainty?
Uncertainty, certainty. Well, I think it's interesting, John, the last time I was sat here in October, the eve of the discussions in our meetings, we saw sterling hit an air pocket in Asian markets and fall 6%. And suddenly the discussion that we had in the meeting in October was very different than we were anticipating. Yesterday we all got surprised by the UK government's announcement that there will be an election called, and I think the process will be approved through Parliament tomorrow, that will happen. I think Tharman's absolutely right that long-term investors really get quite cautious in the face of uncertainty, and we try and think through how do you identify and assess and manage against uncertainty. And investors like clear frameworks around legal tax regimes and tax frameworks in order to be able to make long-term sustainable investment. And it sort of made me laugh yesterday as I was thinking about what remarks to make on this, because I thought most investors have been spending the last few weeks really trying to understand the French election process. Suddenly yesterday, they were like, forget that. How is this going to work? I thought the UK had a very clear law about fixed term of elections, and suddenly there's going to be an election in a very short space of time. But ironically, and I joke about this, but ironically, I actually think the election in the UK will help reduce some of the uncertainty and the potential instability around Brexit, because I think the government that's elected on June the 8th will have a very clear mandate and be able to go into negotiations with a very clear endorsement from the UK population.
Good. One of the things that the MD talked about earlier was productivity. and the IMF has studies on it. We've all been worried about it. U.S. productivity, by the way, is really terrible over the last few years. But let's talk a little bit about productivity. I know, Tharman, you've written about the innovation gap, and this to do with new firms and existing firms and productivity, and the UK's productivity has not really been anything to write home about, unfortunately, and even Mexico could do a little bit better. But Tharman, would you start off a little bit about the productivity issue?
Sure. Well, I think the broad description of the problem is well known. There's been a slowdown in productivity growth almost everywhere, most visibly in the advanced economies, where it's fallen off by about 1 percentage point in the last 5-6 years. What's equally important, and in fact something we get lessons from, is what's happening at the microeconomic level. Why do some states within countries do much better than others? Why are some cities doing better than others? Why are some firms doing much better than others? And something's been happening in the last 10 or so years, in fact, more than 10 years, that wasn't part of economic nature before. If you look at divergences within countries, they've widened for reasons that are not fully understood. If you take the United States, for instance, for about 100 years, states were converging in productivity and living standards. But something's happened in the last 20 years or so. They've started diverging. If you look at Germany, you see the same thing. There was initially a convergence after unification, but if you look today at Baden-Württemberg, you compare it with, say, Bremen, you get divergence. And I'm not talking here about levels of productivity or income, but growth rates. You would normally expect that a country or a region or a firm that starts from a lower level has a chance of catching up and therefore growing faster by copying, tweaking, and sort of taking best practice and putting it into place. But the opposite has been happening. Those that are at a lower level have also been growing more slowly in terms of productivity. And the best studies show that much of that difference is due to what the economists call total factor productivity or multi-factor productivity, which is the intangible side of productivity growth. It's not so much about the machinery, it's not so much about the amount of equipment you put together with workers. It's the intangible side. It's about knowledge, it's about management practice, it's about constant learning on the job, it's about a discipline of dynamism that happens in some firms and in some cities and not others. And there's a lot we can learn from that. Not just in the advanced economies, but the emerging world. If you look at India, for instance, the divergences in the last 10 or 20 years are remarkable. If you compare Tamil Nadu with Bihar, just a widening divergence. So we know some places are less developed, more backward than others, but what's important and what we have to correct is the growing divergence. And I think, if you don't mind me just speaking a little more about this,
please.
I think there are a few broad lessons coming out of the whole welter of experience, countries, cities, firms. First, it helps to be inserted in the new forms of globalization. There are too many countries stuck in the old forms where you export a commodity or you've got a few commodities that you export to the rest of the world, but there isn't much learning that comes from that. There isn't much of a supply-side dynamic that comes from that. That was the old globalization. And economists sometimes look too much at aggregate trade data, which is really quite misleading. The source of dynamism in the countries that have succeeded and the cities and firms that have succeeded is their insertion in global value chains, where you're integrated with cities and firms in the rest of the world as part of the same value chain. And the reason for that has to do with the supply side. It's not a demand side logic, it's a supply side logic. It's about the constant learning that takes place within the value chain and the discipline of having to just keep meeting higher standards, whatever you're talking about, whether it's pharmaceuticals or semiconductors or even processed commodities. That discipline of learning that comes from being part of global value chains. It explains what Nakao-san was talking about earlier on about East Asia. Basically, after Japan, it was the 4 newly industrializing economies, and then the coastal provinces of China. It was global value chains. So that's the first lesson. Too much of the developing world is not in the new globalization and is stuck in the old globalization. And there's a risk that parts of the advanced economies are also not embracing the new globalization. That's the first point. The second point that we're learning is that local strategies matter. Some cities do better than others, not because they are exposed differently to globalization or technology, but because they've got a different dynamic within the city. You've got learning communities comprising mayors and local authorities, universities and community colleges, leading firms, and parents and children taking their signals from what's going on. So getting a dynamic of learning within a city or metropolitan area, anywhere in the world, does differentiate some from others. It differentiates success from stagnation. And I think the third lesson that's extremely important is regulation in some places is preventing people from moving from a declining place to a dynamic place. It's preventing dynamic places from expanding, either because of zonal restrictions on housing or expansion of the dynamic cities. And regulation is doing too much to preserve the status quo. And in the short term, there's always a tension. And frankly, there's a political tension between supporting disruption and changes that lead to improvements in productivity and preserving the jobs of today. And arithmetically, we know that there's a relationship between those two things. If productivity goes up, it usually means it's because you're displacing some workers, you're doing away with old jobs. But that's a short-term tension. The medium to long-term logic that has been seen everywhere is that if you don't lift productivity growth, you get income stagnation in the middle and at the lower end. And that's a much larger problem than the problem of short-term joblessness. So the better solution is do everything we can to allow for restructuring, to allow for the movement of people and firms from declining industries and regions to the more dynamic. Do something to help them to adjust quickly, which the market doesn't do very well on its own. It requires state action. But at the same time, ensure that the jobs that are created are the jobs of tomorrow and not just the preservation of the jobs of today. That's how you reconcile this short-term tension between productivity and jobs. It is through supply-side action and coordinated action.
I think we can agree that the growth problems are more on the supply side now globally. It's hard to point to demand-side actions. It's really the supply-side actions you're talking about. And I think this supply chains and the learning by that is so important. And I want to ask Vanessa here, a lot of trade agreements have emphasized a supply change. And NAFTA, of course, is a big part of what people are learning about. Making parts in one part of the world and shipping it and the creation of different parts. But could you say something about how Mexico's benefited from that in the way that?
Definitely. I think productivity has been seen in this administration as a key and as a priority for national development. And it's the underlining effect that we expect, or one of the underlining effects that we expect as a result from the implementation of the structural reforms again. So, I mean, productivity has to do with education, has to do with better skills, has to do with lifelong learning for lifelong employability in order to be able to switch from these old areas of production to the new areas. But it also has to do with new technologies. It has to do with innovation. It has to do, for example, with the fintech sector. Financial technology is here to stay, is here to provide for financial inclusiveness, is here to provide for new businesses to arise, is here to provide for the faraway communities to be able to be part of globalization and to start a business and to be able to create a P4P or a crowdfunding activity within the financial technology sector. It is very important, another factor, which I think it's the youth, which I think it's the women participating more broadly in the formal economy. it's also a question of moving from informality towards formality. And I think it's a question, as I said, that it's underlying the whole of the reforms as a national priority to increase not only productivity for the export sector, but increase productivity in order, again, to enhance and to make a more robust domestic market. So I think, again, it's the reforms that specifically in the side of education in this aspect that will give us a leap forward in terms of being more productive. But it's all of these aspects that I have talked about that I think would create a conducive environment for a progress in productivity, no? And I would underline women's participation in the formal economy as being one of the key factors. In Mexico, 1 out of every 4 households is headed by a woman, and obviously women are paid 75% of what a man is paid in Mexico for the same job. There is a lot of informality. There is a lot of non-recognized job for women. So I think that is another pending issue that, in particular in developing economies, in particular in Latin America, we need to be looking into and to prioritize as well within this whole framework of having productivity as a priority for development and as a priority for competitiveness now.
So as I look at the data for the U.S., which I know best, I would have to add low capital investment to part of our problem. It's actually, capital per worker is actually declining in the last few years in the U.S. But UK's also had very low productivity. And I don't know which is it more capital, is it more the things that Tharman and Vanessa are referring to, or is it, what is it do you think is the issue there?
So I think it's a combination of all of the factors that have been highlighted, and I think the challenge for the UK is going to be that the next few years is going to be totally focused on the process around, Brexit and withdrawal from the EU and negotiating new access arrangements. And as you know better than anybody else, trade agreements take a long time to get negotiated. I think for Switzerland, it's been 8 years to negotiate trade arrangements with the EU. The UK is heavily dependent on service businesses and service industries, and there hasn't been a precedent of a trade agreement that I know of or arrangement that is defined for service industries. So I think that is going to be the challenge. The current UK government has a clear industrial strategy that they would like to implement that would, encourage and enhance much more capital investment in expenditure. But I fear and I worry that that may take a back seat whilst we have to work through the upcoming, trade discussions with Europe.
One thing is about the financial sector that many of us might be interested in is why has it moved so much? Why have stocks improved so much recently for some firms more than others, to be sure, but some think it's because of this better outlook on regulation. Some think it's monetary policy gives you more of a spread to work with the yield curve. Do you have, from your experience, Clare, do you have a sense of helping us through this one?
So I think, there was clearly a significant movement post the election results here in the US in the financial stocks, equity prices. And, most, I think, strategists and commentators attribute that to an expectation around relaxation on certain capital and liquidity requirements for US and foreign banks here, plus a combination of the impact of tax reform. You saw some of that, coming off some of those numbers in the first quarter of this year. But I still think that the market has an expectation that we'll see some, relaxation in reform. I'm not sure that there's going to be a complete rollback of regulatory reform, but we'll have to wait. I think the Treasury is due to report from the executive order early June, so we'll have to see what's there.
One thing that's also striking about the markets recently is exchange rates. The peso didn't do too well at the beginning, but it's recovered quite a bit. Do you think that's a change in sentiment, reflects perhaps a change in sentiment, a change of what's going to happen? And could you help us with that?
If you take a look the way the peso had evolved in the last 1.5 years at the point of November last year, it was basically an appreciation of the US, specifically vis-a-vis the emerging market currencies. But then after November started to be an idiosyncratic thing in regards to the peso. And obviously was a very correlated result of the electoral result in the US. And again, the volatility and the uncertainty that was created for the outcome, political outcomes in the US. No, so we come from different discussions with the US, more in terms of the secretaries gathering up with secretaries of Foreign Affairs, Treasury, Homeland Security, and the advisors in the White House, and anchoring the discussions specifically for trade. I think basically the two topics that have been placed on the table as part of the trade dialogue would be rules of origin in the one hand and the dispute settling mechanism in the other. That's something that Mexico is transiting with and that Canada is transiting with that we would be able to deal with. But again, there is uncertainty regarding the timing in which these discussions will take place formally, no? Because the announcement to Congress has to be made and then 90 days have to pass for the consultations with the constituency in the US, and then after that we can start with formal negotiations. So there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of times, in terms of expectations, but I think they have been anchored and narrowed down, and that has created more certainty. And obviously, I think a dialogue has been more structured, more permanent, more constant, more on a daily basis in many aspects of the agenda, and that has allowed for better performance of peso. We reached 22.09 at a moment last year. It was 18.5 yesterday. Still a lot of degree of volatility, but I think that markets are getting more used to this new anchoring of the bilateral discussions and the bilateral relationship with the U.S.
It's also, of course, not just the peso-dollar rate that's changed recently. We have the euro and the yen have all changed. The dollar is weaker than it was a couple months ago. One thing, all this discussion revolves around economic policy, and one of the measures of economic policy I like to look at are these indices of economic freedom, or the World Bank has the Doing Business indicator, and Fraser Institute has another. And Singapore is always number 1 or 2, maybe number 2 on these measures, which is always impressive. The U.S. has slipped significantly recently. Mexico did very well during most of NAFTA, but it's kind of leveled off. It seems like there's another burst because it's well below UK or Singapore or the United States. And the UK has also slipped a bit recently. So I guess maybe first, do you think these are helpful measures? Are these the kind of things that are going to help Mexico be more productive if they move higher on these indices? Or doing business, whatever happens? Are those goals that World Bank, the IMF can be pushing more to get better growth performance?
So I think the merit of these indices is that they are simple. Politicians all over the world can look at them and understand what it's about quite easily, and that it creates a mindset of benchmarking yourself against the rest of the field. And that's extremely useful for each city and country to know where they stand compared to the rest of the field. It's useful in education, where you got the PISA and other indices. It's useful in doing business, where the World Bank Index is extremely well used. But we've got to make sure we don't take the wrong lessons from it. if you take Singapore as an example, and it's not the only example I can talk about, it does very well as a place where it's easy to do business, which means that regulations try to enhance your ability to do business and to invest and to enhance productivity. But it's not a place, it's not a laissez-faire economy or society, because on the supply side, there's constant coordination between state, business federations, clusters of firms within industries, and unions. And it's just getting that speed of learning to be always faster than elsewhere. That's a very important source of competitiveness. So low regulations, where regulations will hamper investment and hamper the ability of firms to compete with others elsewhere, but an active coordinating role that's not about picking national champions, it's not about old-style industrial policy. It's about coordination, it's about plugging market failures, because the markets don't do this very well. You can get stuck in a bad place for a very long time if it's just market forces. But the role of the state to help players coordinate, not because the state has great wisdom or intelligence, but because there is a role for coordination in a market economy to help cities and countries learn faster, that cannot be understated. So the Doing Business Index, the various other indices are very useful because of their simplicity, and they create a mindset of comparing yourself with someone else. And that's extremely useful. But you don't get there just from market forces alone.
Vanessa?
I think I agree that they have this positive element of being simple, but sometimes also the challenge has been to be too simplistic sometimes in order, and not to have a thorough view of the different diversities within countries, among countries, certain characteristics that perhaps make one country more competitive against another in a specific aspect. So I think they are relevant. They are relevant as part of an array of products that you need to see when deciding on an investment. It's the macro fundamentals, it's the investment environment, the investment regime, it's the legal framework, it's the implementation of the legal framework, it's the evolution of the economy, it's the competitiveness of the economy, it's productivity. So I mean, they are a good indicator, but I think they're a good indicator among a broader series of information that needs to be used for a thorough decision for investment. So I think they're good. Sometimes there has been these issues about the methodology. For example, the Doing Business just changed methodology 1 year ago. So you're rated in a different way with the previous methodology than with the new one. So I think that we're working with the institutions, and every time we're improving and having standard setting bodies and having these indexes is a good thing. It makes things easy to compare, but at the same time, sometimes you have to go deeper to understand better and to make the right investment decision.
Clare, you want to?
No, I think the only thing I would add to that is you only need to run a few regression models to realise that some of those factors and indicators should be weighted more heavily and are more influential than others. And I think, in terms of, legal stability and rule of law, and I would say that being a former lawyer, and education, etc., and openness, and lack of tariffs and trade barriers are more influential in terms of driving competitiveness than some of the other factors. So I think you take those all into account, as you said, Vanessa, but you need to weight some of them more heavily than others.
I think it would be great if the distance between us and Singapore could be narrowed almost no matter what. But anyway, any questions that want to? Yeah,
I agree.
Yoma. And then, yeah.
Just picking up on your question around productivity and Tharman's reflection on differences within countries. I think NAFTA is a good example of a treaty that really had a very profound impact on the division of a northern part of Mexico, which is integrated into value chains and so on, much more productive, and a southern part of Mexico, which in relative terms is much poorer than before NAFTA. And this is, a worker in Nuevo León is 4 times as productive as a worker in Oaxaca. But even within neighboring states, and this is Tharman's point, there are very large differences. And those can be explained by a set of indicators like the rule of law, ease of doing business, good governance, and so on. I mean, there are very good indicators at the state level in terms of relative competitiveness. That was just an observation there.
Vanessa or Tharman, you want to comment on that? Value chains and no?
Well, definitely, I would say that Guillermo is completely right. I think sometimes the divisions and the variety between the North and the South in the case of Mexico existed before NAFTA, and sometimes in some cases have been exacerbated by NAFTA, no? Because obviously the North has become more competitiveness, whereas the South, in general terms, has had a more of a lag to leap towards the competition in global markets and in local and global chains, productive chains. But one of the things, for example, this administration is doing is the project of special economic zones that are going to be focused in the south and in southeast Mexico. That is one, it's a proposal in order to bridge the gap and to be able to make the South more productive, to give incentives for investment in the South, for investment in education, for investment in different infrastructure and development projects. And we're in the process of implementing them this year. Obviously, it's a medium run project, but still this year are going to be implemented formally. And with this, we are trying to bridge some of the gaps. It's not the only solution, but it's one that is already on the table and is already going to be passed as an executive directive in order to being able to implement. We have been working for the last year on their implementation, and we are going to be able to have a large part of it this year.
Good. Question right here first, and then Laura.
Hi, I'm Dalal World, past governor of the Central Bank of Barbados. My question is for Tharman, and it's related to the productivity point, because there were 2 things that you mentioned about what makes it happen that really resonated with me. One is that local strategies matter, and the second one, that the right kind of regulation also matters, that you want regulation that doesn't protect the past, but actually encourages, brings in the future. And the question is, because they resonate, because, in our situation in the Caribbean, we are very much stuck with the kind of regulation that, defends the past. It doesn't work, but people are wedded to it, with their lives. And also strategies that really do not encourage the learning. So the question is, how do you change the mindset?
So just to respond briefly, because I think you put the question very well, we've got to find a way in which we can provide incentives for governments, federal and local, to do the right things and get a reward because voters vote them in again. Right now, those incentives are not widespread. Too much of politics is about an incentive to preserve the status quo. And ordinary people don't realize it, but they're getting, I'm trying to find a polite word, but they're not getting the right end of the deal. One of the benefits of transparency in today's age, where people have mobile phones, they're comparing themselves not just with the Joneses are not just next door, the Joneses are the next city or a country far away. That transparency is now a much more powerful tool, particularly for a younger population in the emerging world. And I think transparency can be the new sunlight that rewards politicians who do things to create new jobs, to improve education, and to improve people's livelihoods, as opposed to preserving the old. Second point is that there's a role for federal policy that rewards the right local strategies. And there are lessons we can take all over the world. In fact, even in the United States. One of the most successful examples of industrial policy in the broad sense of the term in the United States was the, the land grant universities, where the federal government, a very long time ago, gave land to various states. These were not states that were particularly advanced or doing well, and the land could then be sold and the monies invested in universities. And these have turned out to be astoundingly successful universities. That is a form of industrial policy, and it created a whole dynamic around those universities. But it came about because of a federal policy. We have to think of many such creative solutions for how federal politics and federal decision-making can support the right behavior at a local level. And that plus transparency, which I think is far more potent today than it used to be, even in Bihar or many other places I could think of, far more potent than it used to be.
I think, just as an interjection, education support seems to me distant from industrial policy in the sense that such broad externalities for that, it's like basic research rather than specific. But anyway, you're very well pointed. Laura, over here.
So I thought the contrast between the concept of the government having a coordinating role and the government having a regulatory role is really an important one. And Tharman, I'd like to ask you to give us an example in the coordinating role. I think one thing that came to mind, and it really was touched on in a variety of ways, is all of the work that the government of Singapore is doing in the labor market right now to facilitate transitions, to facilitate training, to making sure that the development of the labor force is connected to where sectors are going. I thought maybe that might be, do you think that's coordination? Is that regulation? Is it a combination of a set of incentives? And I guess I would also think this is a question in general, because I think in Mexico you made the point about the importance of moving people from informality to formality. Some of that may be regulation, some of that may be coordination. It's actually linking them to supply chains in a coordinated way. So I'd like a little more on that distinction, coordination versus regulation.
So if I just give an example, I think in most of the fast-changing industries that you can think of, there's a phenomenon of a shortage of skills. We know very well the world of displacement of jobs and polarization of the job market. That part of the world is well known. But in the same countries, like the United States, like even Germany, like Singapore, there's also a shortage of skills for very good jobs. And for some reason or other, the market doesn't plug that gap very quickly or at all. Education systems all over the world don't take their signals very well from the job market. They should, but it just doesn't happen. And people can get the wrong signals. They can spend years studying the wrong things, and they come out and they're very frustrated. So just providing information alone is useful, but it's not good enough. You actually have to have a working coalition with employers, educational institutions, and with schools, which are the upstream side of universities and colleges, to actually sort of think through, look, how are we going to provide skills for the next 10 or 15 years? You can't predict the world, but you know that some things have changed compared to where you were before. And we've got to start changing curricula, we've got to start changing students' sort of impressions of what's likely to create success for themselves, and start changing the minds of the public at large. It requires not a paternalistic state, but it requires an activist state. And there is a big distinction between them. We sometimes scoff at these things too easily by talking about it as if it's a paternalistic state. It's actually about helping markets work better, because for some reason or another, some markets just don't work well. And there's a role for the state coordinating with other economic actors and non-economic actors to help markets work better.
Anybody else want to add on this? Or?
Just very briefly, I think in terms of the changing from informality to formality, I think it's a mix of both. No, for example, what we have done in terms of regulation has been to create incentives in order for people to have the right choice, no, and the right incentives to move towards formality, even to simplify the way an individual worker can start becoming formal. And have a very easy way to do that in terms of doing it with the tax authority. But also it implies definitely a wide degree of coordination, not only of labor policies, but social policies, training policies, education policies that are also enablers of this transition. No? So I think it's both.
Questions? Okay, right here.
Yes.
Domingo.
Domingo Cavallo from Argentina. I heard worries in some emerging countries on the possible effect of the tax reform in the United States. Basically, that the lowering of the tax rate on corporate income plus the border tax adjustment could generate a strong appreciation of the dollar and force somehow a reduction in the prices of goods that enter into the foreign trade of the United States. Are these worries justified from your point of view, or probably it will be a sort of negligible effect?
So let me ask the people who would be affected for a minute. But first of all, there's different proposals. The border tax adjustment is one thing. The lower corporate tax is another. You could have a lower corporate tax and not have the border adjustment. So I just would want to separate those out. But anyway, what do you guys think? Yeah.
Well, I think, and forgive me for oversimplifying, but the nub of these proposals is that it's a value-added tax with a distortion. And the distortion is one of benefiting exports over imports. Now, if I can just make a broad point that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. For whatever the state of the world, whatever the state of demand, countries that have higher exports and higher imports do better than countries which have lower exports and lower imports. And there's a way in which importing is part of the dynamic of exporting and part of your participation in global value chains. And the supply side dynamic associated with high exports and high imports is quite different from the supply side dynamic of low exports and low imports. So as much as possible, taxes shouldn't discriminate between exports and imports. If you want to tax consumption, tax consumption. If you want to tax gasoline, tax gasoline. Keep it clean, keep it simple, and then help those who for reasons of income or opportunity need some additional help. So focused assistance for the poor so as to offset any regressivity that has to do with the flat consumption tax. I think that's far more efficient, and economists of both the left and right should agree on that. Economists of both the left and right should agree on that. That's the fairest policy to help the poor, and it's also the most efficient policy to get growth going.
Vanessa?
I would only add that depends on which of the proposals implies a higher degree or a lesser degree of concern for a country like Mexico, and I guess for the rest of the world. But I think what we are looking into is, first of all, there's no proposal yet. There has been a lot of proposals. Secretary Mnuchin said yesterday in an interview that there's 100 people at the Treasury working on different proposals that might come in the coming months. So I think we still don't know what the outcome will be, but obviously the less disruptive for the world trade, for imports and exports, would be obviously a better outcome for us, and I think for the world in general. Some of the proposals that have been there in the noise and on and off the table, I think have a high degree of being disruptive for global trade and for the international tax regime and for local regimes everywhere. So I think we need to analyze once the proposals are set on the table, but definitely there's a huge difference between the degree of disruptiveness between ones and the others that have been already been around the air. No?
Clare?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree, and I think sometimes it's lost that the UK's external investment is significant into the US, so obviously, you know, changing tax, etc., would be pretty meaningful. And that data point is often, you know, overlooked or missed.
So I think we have time. Is there a question here? Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Deirdre White with Pixera Global. Thank you so much for the comments on the role of state action and coordination. Really appreciate that. And I'm clear on what some of the actions and policies might be from that perspective. But while we wait for that to happen, do you have any advice for the private sector and large global corporations on actions they could take in terms of that new globalization and constant learning? What can we be doing while policies catch up to the current realities? Thank you.
Who wants to take that one on? You're not jumping.
Well, I think again at the local level, things are already moving and have been moving quite differently in some cities compared to other. Pittsburgh is different from Detroit. And it's not a matter of whether it's Democrat control or Republican control, because at a local level, businesses tend to want to do business with whoever's in government and whoever's running educational institutions. So there's a lot of that dynamic that can already take place, regardless of the broader sort of shifts in policy or the, you know, you'll always get ideological shifts in one direction or another. But the fascinating thing that strikes you when you look at every large economy, you look at France, Germany, the UK, you know, the difference between Leeds and Wolverhampton or Middlesbrough is startling difference. Same country, same external forces, same regulatory apparatus, but different outcomes. There's something to be followed and copied from that cluster of learning that takes place in some cities so that we can adopt it in other cities.
So we'll have to leave it at that. The second hand just tells me to stop. And that's it. Thank you very much. Great.